The people who know Guy Penrod best never talked. Not to the press, not to the gospel music circuit, not even to the fans who had followed his voice across 3 decades of homecoming stages and Sunday morning broadcasts. Angie Penrod kept her family behind a wall of privacy, so deliberate it seemed almost architectural, and the children who grew up in that Tennessee household understood from an early age that what happened inside their home belonged to them alone. That silence held for years, and then one of Guy's daughters broke it, not for attention, not for promotion, but because she believed the people who had loved her father from a distance deserved to finally hear the version of him the stage never fully captured. What she shared carries no scandal in it. No collapsed marriage, no hidden failure that betrays the public image. And that absence of scandal is exactly what gives her account its weight. Because the culture has trained all of us to brace for the opposite. What she gave people instead was something rarer and harder to find in gospel music or anywhere else. An honest portrait of a man who genuinely tried to be who he appeared to be, and what that cost him across the long years when nobody outside his family could see it. Guy Penrod joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 1994, and audiences felt his presence from the very first concert. Great singers had occupied that stage before him, and great singers would follow. But the combination of that searching tenor voice, the long hair, the cowboy bearing, and a quality of unguarded worship that seemed to forget cameras existed entirely, set him apart from everyone who came before. The early homecoming recordings did something to the people who found them. Penrod's voice became the one that showed up at the hardest moments, playing quietly in the background when someone said goodbye to a parent, coming through car speakers when grief finally broke open, carrying words of Christian faith into rooms where ordinary language had already given out. Fans across 30 years never described him as simply a performer. Minister who happened to sing for a living is the phrase that surfaces again and again. And it surfaces because it fits. Glorious, redeemed he is. All of them delivered standing at the front of the stage with his arms open and eyes closed, leading rooms full of believers into something audiences described consistently as the closest thing to heaven they had touched in this life. Back home in Tennessee, he and Angie were raising 8 children together, building a faith-centered household he spoke about with obvious pride in every interview where the subject came up. By every visible measure, the gospel music community considered Guy Penrod genuinely blessed. And that's exactly why what his daughter shared shifts the entire picture. To understand what she said, it helps to know where Penrod stood in the mid-2000s. 14 years with the Gaither Vocal Band had produced some of the most beloved recordings in the history of Southern gospel music. And he had become, in many ways, the emotional center audiences associated with the group, the presence that locks a moment into memory years after you've seen the footage. The touring schedule pressed on without real rest, and the recording schedule pressed on alongside it, and every year added more weight to what those demands were asking of his time, his energy, and his body. By 2008, something had to change. When the departure from the Gaither Vocal Band came that year, the gospel music community responded with genuine sadness, and speculation followed almost immediately. Some fans pointed toward health, others toward the natural pull of solo work. The official statements were warm, gracious, and carefully short on specifics, which is how those announcements tend to go. Penrod spoke about Bill Gaither's influence on his life and the gratitude he carried for every night on that stage, and left most of the rest unsaid. What he left unsaid is exactly what his daughter has now put into words. She painted a picture of a father who poured everything he had into his ministry, night after night, praying before every concert, and then finding his way back to hotel rooms in cities he had already lost count of. Phone calls home came at strange hours, and she noticed early that the voice coming through the phone sounded different from the one filling the arena. Growing up in that household meant carrying a specific kind of pride alongside a specific kind of awareness, even as a young girl, that her father was holding something heavy the stage never showed. What came through her account wasn't resentment. No bitterness surfaced, no record of lasting damage, even as she spoke honestly about the long stretches her father spent away from home. What came through instead was something more complicated and ultimately more moving. The picture of a man whose Christian faith was going through testing that never appeared on any recording. The season when Guy Penrod, the man thousands watched raising his hands in worship on television week after week, was working through questions in private that had no clean answers. Questions about calling, questions about whether the life the road had built around him still lined up with the convictions he carried everywhere he went. This is where her account arrives at the part she clearly hadn't planned to say out loud. The detail that puts everything before it into a different frame. She described a specific season, placing it in the stretch just before Guy's departure from the Gaither Vocal Band, when he came home from touring and sat with his family in a way that registered differently from the usual returns. No crisis, no collapse, none of the drama that rumors sometimes attach to that period. Just the quiet and deliberate manner of a man who had done serious thinking on the road, arrived somewhere honest, and was ready to share what he found there. Penrod gathered his children and told them in plain language that he had been wrestling with what it actually meant to live the songs he sang, not perform them for audiences, but genuinely carry them home. Redeemed meant something specific to him. Glorious meant something. Every word he had put that voice behind represented a covenant he held with complete seriousness, and he told his children he had come to believe the way he was living needed to line up more closely with that covenant. The music wasn't ending. What was ending was the distance he had allowed to build, gradually and without drama, between the man he wanted to be and the schedule the road had constructed around him. That conversation permanently changed how his daughter understood her father, not because it made him larger than life, but because it showed him as genuinely human in a way no performance ever could. The man she had watched move thousands to tears in arenas and church halls was sitting in her family's home admitting out loud that he was still growing, still pressing against hard questions, still holding his faith up to the light and asking what it required of him next. The emotion surfaced years later when she described what she finally understood about 2008. Stepping back from the Gaither Vocal Band was not Penrod walking away from his calling in Christian music. Walking toward the 8 people at home in Tennessee who deserved the same full presence audiences had always received from him. That's what it was. Mark Lowry, who never ran short of opinions, put it plainly across multiple interviews. Penrod ranked among the most genuinely sincere people he had ever shared a stage with across his entire career. David Phelps, whose own voice carried forward the tradition Penrod helped define within the band, pointed to that influence as something he still carries in his own work. Those weren't polished compliments delivered for cameras. Those were assessments from men who had watched Guy Penrod operate up close, on stage and off, and were reporting exactly what they found. His daughter's account lands as confirmation of what devoted fans already carried somewhere in their understanding. The Guy Penrod visible in the homecoming videos wasn't a crafted persona constructed for television. That was him. And the private father who sat with his children and spoke honestly about the gap between the life he wanted and the life the road was demanding was consistent, right through to the details, with everything those fans had believed about him for 30 years. Bill Gaither built the entire homecoming movement on an understanding that applies here. Real Christian faith, as Gaither has put it across dozens of settings over the years, doesn't get softened into something comfortable and easy. The artists who stand on those stages and lead thousands in worship drive home afterward carrying the same accumulated weight as everyone in the audience. And the songs mean more, not less, when the strain behind them is visible. Penrod understood that better than most of the people who shared those stages with him. Michael English carries one of the most discussed chapters in Gaither history, built on a voice of genuine power and a journey through the 1990s and 2000s that became painful, public, and ultimately honest. The candor English brought to his later interviews about the gap between the man performing on stage and the man struggling off of it required real courage, and the gospel music community is still reckoning with what he gave them by being willing to go there. Russ Taff answered a version of that same question in the documentary I Still Believe, and what emerged became one of the most talked about records in recent Southern gospel history, not because of the scale of the struggle Taff described, but because of the honesty he brought to describing it. The most important thing his faith ever required of him, Taff put it plainly, was the willingness to be seen clearly, and he drew a distinction between clearly and perfectly that matters. Penrod belongs in that lineage. His daughter's account places him there without apology, not as a man spared from struggle, but as one who carried his struggle honestly, brought it back to Tennessee, and chose the harder and quieter work of showing up fully for the 8 people who needed him most. His voice, by every account, has deepened across the years in a way that goes beyond the natural settling of an instrument into maturity. Something accumulated in there across 3 decades, the lived weight of the songs he carried. The difference between a voice performing conviction and a voice that actually earned it is something listeners feel without being able to name precisely, and Penrod's voice has always belonged to the second kind. Everything his daughter shared explains why that quality was never in danger of leaving. What Penrod is still becoming, and what the next chapter holds for a man who, according to everyone closest to him, hasn't finished surprising the people who love him, stays an open question for the gospel community to watch unfold. Fans who have stayed with this ministry through 30 years of homecoming stages and Sunday mornings and long drives with the radio turned up know one thing clearly. This story isn't finished. Neither is the story of what that voice has meant to the millions who found in it something ordinary language and ordinary music couldn't give them.